During the First World War, a new condition emerged that caught the military and medical establishment completely off guard. There was no telling who would be affected by it or why. Those who suffered from it might be hypnotized or electrocuted, arrested or shot, all for the same illness. So many men were lost to it, there would be a revolution in military attitudes and a new field of medicine created. The condition was called shell shock.
These are the men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed.
The war on the Western Front was different from any war fought before. New machines dominated the fighting. Modern factories produced gas and high explosives, used for the first time on an industrial scale. Sustained shelling caused horrific injuries and dismemberment, testing the endurance of Britain's soldiers.
You were living in a land of impossibility, death, blood, mud, pouring with rain, boiled with sun. You could have run away for miles. And if I hadn't have had a command, I think I should have run away. I think I couldn't have stuck it.
No one, from new recruits to experienced officers, was prepared for trench warfare. Traditional ideas of courage and cowardice were slowly eroded as the misery of the conflict took its toll.
Every time a shell came back or dropped near you, you were on the shakes. But you got to try and control that. Some would laugh it off, others would be shaky or a bit nervous about it. But you got anybody who it seems to be a bit too frightened, you got to try and pat them on the back and say, "Come on, old boy, you're all right."
From the very outset, casualties were heavy. Soldiers returning from the front were overwhelmed by the brutality of this war. Dr. Charles Myers, a pioneering psychologist, was appalled by the suffering of trench warfare. In October 1914, he decided to offer his services to the military.
My father was very, very concerned about conditions out there, and he moved about from hospital to hospital, and in many cases he went up to the dressing stations very close to the firing line and saw these men directly they came out from the firing line, and he was pleased he was so near because he could undertake treatment for them straight away after their disasters with the bombs.
Soon after his arrival in France, Myers treated a private who had been trapped in barbed wire in no man's land. Although several shells had burst nearby, the soldier was untouched. But ever since the explosions, he had been partially blind. Myers was intrigued. He could find no physical cause for the man's condition. Other similar cases, mostly from the ranks, soon came to his notice. In February 1915, he reported his findings to the Lancet and concluded that the bursting of a shell had caused an invisibly fine molecular commotion in the soldier's brain. In other words, a physical shock to the nervous system had caused the strange symptoms. From this, he coined the term shell shock.
I suppose shell shock made much sense. It captured exactly what was happening. There were lots of shells around, there was lots of blast, lots of shock, and people, after being blown up or buried after being blown up, were in a state of shock. So I think it was a wonderful term because it described it quite perfectly.
To the Army's alarm, more and more cases of shell shock began to appear. After just 6 months of war, 15% of the British Army was judged to be suffering from the condition. The most extreme cases were blind, deaf, mute, or shaking, yet all without an apparent cause, other than their proximity to bombardment. Similar cases appeared in the French and German armies on the Western Front.
The shell shock are the symptoms of a mental person. All the signs and symptoms, shaking, head shaking, hands shaking, body shaking, they were, in other words, they weren't themselves. They had to be nursed, taken to the toilets and all that sort of business. They weren't fit to be left on their own. I mean to say, if you had a few shells bursting round you, you wouldn't feel so happy, would you?
The medical press highlighted the worrying number of cases. The British medical journals stirred up interest by reporting examples such as a sergeant with a paralyzed trigger finger who could no longer fire a rifle. The term shell shock became the common description for any soldier suffering an unexplained problem. Preventative measures had to be taken. In March 1915, the Army appointed Dr. Myers as consultant neurologist to deal with the growing problem. But Myers was already concerned that the term shell shock was a complete misnomer.
He found that many of the casualties who were labelled under that definition had never been near a bomb to suffer from the shell shock that most people feel associated with bombardment. And it was just their psychological problems that had accounted for the disastrous mental state.
Myers realized that the causes of shell shock were far more complex than he'd first thought. He was now convinced that shell shock was not a physical problem, but a mental one. Soldiers' unconscious minds so distressed by war crippled their bodies and took them out of the fighting. The military found it hard to accept such a radical theory. It undermined the belief that men could and should control their fears and emotions. Captain Herbert Leland was an officer in his mid-40s who had fought in numerous campaigns. From the trenches, he wrote almost daily to his wife, Lena. His letters are the personal testimony of a man's struggle to maintain his sanity.
I was at the front this morning. You could not believe the scene of desolation. Mud, muck, misery and melancholy reign supreme, and a pitiless bombardment adds to the general discomfort. Death and glory, I suppose they call it. All my friends are gone. Not a soul to go to, even for a chat. How I do wish I could tell you some things. I dare not, of course, for you would never get my letters.
One of the senior officers saw my grandfather and said, Leland, these bombs don't seem to affect you. And he says, little does he know, but what is the point of hiding? You get used to it, but it still actually affects you very much.
When you see so much death, you obviously believe that perhaps the next bullet or the next barrage will have your name on it. And it is fearful. Some weeks, some people were frightfully brave, and yet the following week, they could hardly hold things together at all. It's a variable entity. Fear of death, fear of being afraid, seeing so much death. Really a nightmare. So how do you cope with it? I don't know. How do you prepare for it? I don't know. Perhaps you can't.
By the end of 1915, the British Army had suffered 500,000 casualties. 13,000 were diagnosed as shell-shocked. The milder cases were treated by Myers and his colleagues in France. The more severely affected men, referred to by the army as noisy mental cases, were sent back to Britain. At first, the men were treated as if they were lunatics and therefore incurable. But at Myers' urging, special shell shock hospitals were set up. One of these was the Royal Victoria Military Hospital at Netley in Hampshire. The aim was to segregate shell-shocked men and to test new methods of treatment.
We used to walk across the fields to the hospital, and these fields were all covered in tents. There was hundreds of these tents. And my mother used to keep on to me, shh, shh, don't make a noise. Well, why, Mum, why? Well, they're shell-shock patients and they can't stand the slightest sound.
This footage, filmed at the Royal Victoria at the height of the war, is an extraordinary record of the impact of war on the minds of men. The doctors, feeling their way, decided that the men were suffering from hysterical conversion symptoms. That is, the men's mental distress produced a physical symptom: rigid limbs, extreme shivering, or loss of speech. In this case, a deaf man responds only to the word bomb.
Somehow the mind splits itself off from the body, that they're almost two distinct entities. And we see this after exposure to very traumatic and upsetting events. We know that some of the war psychiatrists talk about people going blind because they just can't bear seeing the carnage around them.
The doctors at Netley began to classify the different symptoms. They gave their patients' conditions outlandish names: hysterical dancing gait, hysterical slippery ice gait, and battling with the wind. Treatment at this stage was basic: massage, bed rest, and a milk diet. As a new phenomenon, shell shock sparked enormous interest in the medical community. Everyone wanted to find a cure, and the army gave doctors a free hand.